Now on BBC Two, the latest political conversation with Joe Colburn.
It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP Damian Collins, Claire Hanna of the SDLP, Annabel Denham from the free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, and The Guardian's Gabby Hinsliff. Today, boosters to protect against variants.
We approach this in the same way that it would just be normal, in a sense, as we do with the flu vaccine, to update it, to catch anything the virus has tried to do to outwit us, to make sure we keep ahead of it.
This is what David Cameron promised back in 2010.
No more pointless reorganisations of our National Health Service.
Big reforms followed anyway, but now they're being scrapped.
The protocol has betrayed us and has made us feel like foreigners in our own country.
Is the Brexit deal putting a wedge between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK? Let's start today's programme with the idea that we may have to get used to booster vaccinations every year to protect against any potential new variants. My question to the panel to start us off is, are we ready for this? Damian?
Well, we already have it with the winter flu jab. We're used to having particularly more vulnerable people in our society regularly vaccinated. And so I could easily see that being the case with COVID. But the good thing is, as a country, is we've got the expertise and the infrastructure to deliver that, as we do now and have done every year.
Right, Claire, do you think the public is psychologically ready for more vaccination boosters like we may have to get used to with COVID?
I think so. I think it's an appropriate note of caution. Everybody is feeling hope about the vaccines and needs that sense of hope, but we also have to be real about the ongoing threat. I think Damian is right. We've shown that we can roll out the vaccine programme, and the infrastructure is there to do flu on every year, and hopefully in future years the NHS won't also be fighting the acute phase and staff isolation and so on. So I think people see a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, but we do have to be clear that normality isn't coming very, very soon. Annabel, are you ready for it?
Yes, and I think that the public are. I think we just need to remind ourselves that there's always going to be mixed news. The situation is changing, evolving very, very rapidly. But ultimately, the news that we are getting is broadly extremely positive. Vaccines are a game changer. They are the silver bullet that is going to get us out of this crisis. And if we need booster jabs down the line, then that's just what's needed, and I think the public will accept it.
Right, interesting you use the phrase silver bullet. Do you see them, the vaccines, Gabby, as a silver bullet for protecting against COVID, for the next 5 years?
It's never been a get out of jail free card. That's the thing that I think we're realising now. All credit to everybody involved in the vaccine rollout programme. It's been amazing, and if we all have to roll up our sleeves every autumn, that's absolutely fine by me. But I think what we're seeing now is that vaccines won't offer necessarily as effective protection against new variants, and that may mean that we have to accept that there will be some sort of gaps in our protection, and we are going to have to think about plan B, backup measures and backup restrictions potentially, which will support the vaccine scheme.
Right, well, Gabby, picking up on what you've just said, over the weekend, you may or may not have heard that the results of a small clinical trial for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine in terms of protection against the South African variant did indicate that it isn't as effective in preventing mild to moderate illness. Now, Sarah Gilbert, who led the Oxford team, was asked about this at the weekend, and this is how she responded.
Maybe we won't be reducing the number of cases as much, but we still won't be seeing the deaths, the hospitalisations and the severe disease. And that's really important for healthcare systems. Even if we're having mild and asymptomatic infections, this year we expect to show that the new version of the vaccine will generate antibodies that recognise the new variant. And then it will be very much like working on flu vaccines.
Right. Now, this, of course, may have social implications going forward and raises the discussion about what sort of measures may need to be retained for some time. The Daily Telegraph has this headline: restrictions on large gatherings likely for the next few years. Professor Tim Spector from King's College London predicted that sporting events and big weddings with international guests will remain on hold. Is that how you see it, Damien?
Not necessarily, no. I think the rollout of the vaccination programme is clearly very important. And with regard to the South Africa study as well, it was a small study, but the man who ran that study said that he believes the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is very similar to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is working in South Africa and has a very, very high success rate in protecting particularly more vulnerable people from serious COVID and that would require hospitalization. And that really, I think, has got to be the key thing we want the vaccine to deliver, that yes, some people may get it in a very mild form, but it's not going to be in a form that would require them go to hospital or could be life-threatening. And that's then, I think, when you can look to say, well, actually, society can reopen because we've delivered the protections that people need from getting COVID in a serious way. And then I think mass gatherings, large events, big weddings, we can look forward to them once again.
Gabby?
True, that's what everyone wants to hear and wants to think. I think, I should just say, if you've had the Oxford jab and you're sitting at home now wondering that, worrying that it might not be protecting you, we know that it's effective against the Kent variant that we have here. We know that it's effective against the variants that are predominant in this country. But we don't know what may come down the line in terms of variants over the next few months. And that's, I think, just where the doubt creeps in. That's why it's hard to say for the long term exactly what is and isn't going to be possible. We're dealing with the variants we've got. We don't know what other variations will crop up.
Annabelle, what's your reaction to the story in the Telegraph about large gatherings?
Well, two things I'd say. The first is that we need to be a bit cautious about making the best be the enemy of the good. The important thing here is that we're downgrading coronavirus from a deadly virus to a nasty bug. And we also need to remember that it's a scientist saying this. He's perhaps not needing to consider all of the political and economic ramifications. And that leads me to my next point, which is why hasn't the government set out criteria for its tolerance for risk? As I say, this is constantly changing. There's mixed news, but it's broadly positive. And what we need to know is, what are the trade-offs that the government is going to make? And, what is its risk tolerance? Because it cannot be zero.
Claire?
Well, I think the big breakthrough, of course, was getting the jab done, and adaptations that may be needed are relatively simple. But I think we need to keep two things in mind. And one is the global picture. The UK has done very well on vaccinations and is right to be proud of that. But the reality is it's a small world and nobody is protected and safe until everybody is. And there is a risk of keeping importing new variations. And the second thing is, though, yes, we are keeping the NHS from the point of collapse by protecting the most vulnerable and managing the most serious effects. But some of the small adaptations in everyday life, like masks, like some degree of distancing, make sense until we're rid of this thing completely. So everybody's dying to get back to social contact. And I think people will be prepared to make a little bit of a trade-off, that some of those smaller self-protection measures are still in place, but they do allow us to see our friends and to be social animals that we are.
Well, let's stick with the issue of health. And I'm just going to show our viewers this BBC story, which is about NHS reorganisation. It says here, NHS, government plans to reverse Cameron-era reforms. This is David Cameron and talking about the reorganisation of the health service in something called the 2012 Health and Social Care Act. It was about a reorganisation of NHS planning and commissioning. We're just going to play you part of an interview I did with the then Health Minister in 2012 from the Daily Politics. Let's have a look.
What will be different is there will not be the day-to-day political micromanagement from Whitehall of the NHS. What we will see is doctors taking control of commissioning care for their patients. We will see cutting back on bureaucracy, partly through the bill, but also through the QUIP programme, so that the money that is saved can be reinvested in the NHS.
Well, that was Simon Burns in 2012, talking about what he thought would be the benefits. Let's talk now to Sharon Brennan from the Health Service Journal. Sharon, what did the Lansley, they were Andrew Lansley reforms, he was the Health Secretary at the time, what did the Lansley reforms do to the NHS?
On a very broad level, they created a reorganisation at a local level, which meant that there was originally these boards called strategic health authorities, and they turned them into clinical commissioning groups. The idea of that was that GPs would learn to commission for their own population so that the people they were treating would get the care they needed. That was largely seen as quite disastrous. And then on a national level, they effectively tried to depoliticise the NHS by creating NHS England and giving the power to NHS England to which is an answer body, to control how the NHS was being run and to kind of create their own strategies. So it was quite a step change in the sense that the Department of Health would no longer have direct control over the NHS.
Right, so Sharon, why are they now being stripped away?
Well, two reasons. I think the Lansley reforms were not welcome when they were introduced, and they haven't worked. Although we've had like an internal market and working in the NHS for quite a while, the Lansley reforms introduced a commissioner-provider split, which for your listeners is basically there was a gap between the people who were buying your care and the people who were therefore then offering the care. That has been really hard to manage. It's created a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of admin time, and basically is seen as kind of going against the grain of the NHS, which really is about collaboration and helping people, helping trust to care for patients rather than compete for patients. So that's changing, and I think that's very welcome within the system. The other thing that's changing is that it looks very much like the Department of Health wants its power back. And, you know, in short, I think it's changing because there was frustration with how Simon Stevens, who's led NHS England, kind of used his power to get what he needed in terms of finances, staff, and kind of control over the national agenda. And I think ministers have had enough of that.
Right. I mean, talking about it, of course, as we are, to some extent in the abstract, what difference would the public have actually noticed when using health services under the Lansley reforms?
What they were meant to notice was that if you didn't like care in your local hospital, the idea was, as Lansley said at the time, was you could vote with your feet and go elsewhere. Obviously, that doesn't work for people who are busy parents or less economically able to travel for care. So what they probably would have found was that some areas gave very good care and some areas gave very bad care. In terms of the change now, the point is to hopefully integrate your care better, which for the person listening means your GP should know what's happening to you in your secondary care, which is like a hospital, and your secondary care should know what's happening in your GP. So hopefully your experience as a patient will be a lot easier. Whether that happens or not is kind of time to tell, really.
Right, so has it, in your mind, turned out to be a pointless reorganisation, the very thing that David Cameron said he wanted to avoid at the time?
Largely, it has been pointless. It created a lot of distraction for about 3 years when really the NHS should have focused on getting its waiting list down and managing its finances better. Two things I think that were good. I do believe that NHS England having that independence to set its own strategy and to try and get away from political rows over what the department should and shouldn't be doing, that was welcomed. And I would be, I'd be interested to hear NHS England's response, but I can't imagine Sir Simon Stevens is happy with proposals as they stay. I think the other thing that's interesting was previously, it was very much like the previous organisation with marking its own homework. And there was an attempt in the Lansley organisation to make sure that the money that was being spent was good quality and taxpayers were getting best value for money. And I think the current legislation doesn't include that element.
Okay.
So there are two issues there that I think were beneficial over what was ultimately a disastrous reform.
Right. Well, thank you very much. On that last point, Damien, a disastrous reform. When I think back to the time and energy that was expended politically and practically, do you now think it was a pointless reorganisation that was carried out by the Conservative-led government?
No, I don't think it was a pointless reorganisation. I look at what's happened in my own constituency area. I think we've seen with the local clinical commissioning groups more GP leadership in delivery of services. I think the establishment of NHS England was a good reform as well. But I think looking where we are now, nearly a decade on, I think and in response to a pandemic, which I think has stress tested the whole system, I think we can see that we need better integration between primary and secondary care, between the GPs and the hospitals, and integration with social care as well. And I think in terms of the role of ministers, and whilst we'll have to wait to see what the government proposals are, whilst it's good that NHS England has independence to plan for the future, we also can see that the expectation is that ministers will also be able to make sure that the right outcomes are delivered, as we've seen through the pandemic.
Damien, we seem to be having some interference. I can hear another voice on the line, wherever that's coming from. I'm just going to pause you there while we go to Gabby to answer. Gabby, just to remind viewers, of course, these were reforms that were carried out in the NHS in England. But do you think it was pointless at the time?
I think even at the time there were some regrets. I mean, it was seen in Number 10 as this sort of very technical thing that Andrew Lansley was obsessed with and no one else was that interested in, so let him get on and do it. And then I think only halfway through, when it became quite physically toxic, Number 10 woke up and thought, hang on, what do we sort of let loose here? And there was always a degree of ambivalence about it and about the sort of the sheer sort of the amount of negative publicity it created and also the amount of upheaval it created in the NHS. Was it really worth it, what it delivered? So, good to see government, coming back on that and having learned some of the lessons of the past year, which has been the NHS works best when it's collaborative. All bits of the NHS have pulled together and worked together. Even at micro level during this crisis, you've seen consultants pitching up in ICU doing shifts as healthcare assistants because their bit of the hospital isn't busy, So that sort of sense that the NHS has that we all pull together in the crisis, it's good to see the government responding to that by moving towards a more collaborative, less competitive model. I'd quite like to see what happens to public health under this reorganisation, because of course what Lansley did was hive it away from the main NHS and park its budget with local government, where it's been unfortunately subject to cutbacks over the last few years. So it'd be interesting to see where that ends up. It's an awkward time now, though, to do a big reorganisation, because obviously the NHS is quite busy with a pandemic, and to try and start sort of reorganising the debt chairs in the middle of that is obviously going to be quite difficult.
Annabelle?
Sure, well, I agree with Gabby that the timing is certainly extraordinary, but my concern is also with the narrative. I mean, it seems quite strange to suggest that things have gone wrong because the government didn't have control of the NHS this time, but we have one of the most centralised healthcare systems in the world. So ultimately, the government is saying that things went wrong with government in control, and the solution is more government control.
Right. Well, Claire, what do you think about that as an issue? I mean, is it a good thing to have a monolithic, centralised NHS?
Well, it's worth saying that these reforms didn't really apply here, and that's not to say that the health service here is in any way perfect, but they do seem to have been wrong-headed. I wasn't around at the time, but my assessment from reading about it was pretty much as Gabby Hinsliff has outlined there, that they seem to introduce the worst aspects of marketisation and the worst aspects of bureaucracy and mainstream them. And if there were moves to come back from that, I think it would be very welcome. But I think the proposals and the floating of having more ministerial and political control are very concerning. And I say this with the appropriate amount of respect. I don't have great faith in the bona fides of this government as regards to the NHS and management of the NHS. And I think that will give concern, to say nothing of the fact that, the service is in the fight of its life at the moment on COVID and probably doesn't have the bandwidth to be, doing a lot of administrative reform. I mean, isn't this in the wrong time, Damien?
Well, I say, look, we're based on a story which is not based on a government statement or a proposed set of measures, but on reporting. But I think it would be extraordinary if post-COVID we didn't say, well, let's look at how we responded to a pandemic, and if we had to deal with that challenge in the future, what lessons would be learned, and are there structural lessons for the way the health service works as well? I mean, let's be clear, the health service has done an incredible job coping with the demands that have been placed on it by a pandemic and making sure that people are getting the treatments that they need. I think what's also demonstrated as well is that actually it isn't monolithic. It's a series of organisations that work together that are managed differently. And we want to improve the way they talk to each other and they communicate with each other, the way they share data with each other, the way they manage patients' needs through the different aspects of the service that's provided through hospitals, GPs, and social care and community care as well. So I think it's right that we should be constantly challenging ourselves to say, do we think we can improve on this?
Right, but managed differently through other parts of the UK, Claire, as you were saying too. What do you think we should learn then from the pandemic in terms of any changes to the NHS?
Well, I suppose at the very top line is the value of it and the fact that, even though it had been left in a perilous state, it was what kept all of us, I suppose, and society from from collapse. So I suppose we try and garner that sense of buy-in and support and I suppose value that people are now seeing and placing properly on the National Health Service. And I think we should translate that over into the longer term conversation about funding. And I welcome separate proposals around, for example, windfall taxes on those who have done very well out of the pandemic. I proposed similar to the Chancellor last year. So I think we bank the newfound interest in protecting the NHS from across the political spectrum, and we talk very seriously about how to give it the best possible governance opportunities and certainly give it the funding it needs in the long term.
Right, but Annabelle, has the vaccination rollout, the success of it in terms of the numbers of people that have been vaccinated by the NHS, point to a more centralised way of running health services in England as being better?
Well, certainly the vaccination rollout has been a great success for the country and for the NHS. But fundamentally, what we need is root and branch reform of the healthcare service. Now, over the course of 2020, NHS had net approval ratings of between 80 and 88%. And what worries me is that while this was, I imagine, mostly about the heroic efforts of doctors and nurses on the front line, it's going to make reform of the NHS extremely difficult. We need to remember that these workers are trapped in a failed system, and that ultimately we did have one of the worst excess death tolls over the course of 2020 and as a result of this pandemic.
It's not a failure of the NHS, though, that death toll. I don't know that that's a failure of the way the NHS operated. It might be the failure of the way government operated through this crisis. I don't think it's a mark of failings in the NHS.
Annabelle?
I'm so sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Oh, well, Gabby, repeat it.
Sound issue.
Sorry, I hope everyone heard that. But no, I wouldn't say it was a result of failings in the NHS that we had one of the highest death tolls in the world. Failings of governance, maybe failures of policy, but I'm not sure what failures within the NHS you identify there as contributing to the high death toll.
Annabelle?
Well, I think it's very difficult to really learn any lessons from this pandemic, but it seems that one of the conventional wisdoms is that the NHS and any mistakes or missteps there might have been is now beyond reproach. But if you look at some of the countries that have performed best on the key indicators, particularly in terms of healthcare outcomes, they're the Asian tigers, and they have healthcare systems that are nothing like the one that we have here in the UK.
Their healthcare systems. That's not to do with their healthcare systems, surely. That's to do with their success in test and trace. That's to do with the speed in some cases with which they close their borders. That's to do with previous experience with SARS and MERS. I don't know that it's to do with the quality of the healthcare provided. The issues that we've been looking at in this country are, could we get test and trace off the ground? Did we lock down too late? Did we unlock too early? Those are policy decisions that are taken at the top. And of course, there may be some issues there about how the NHS and government communicate to each other or how government and scientists communicate with each other. But I don't think that we're looking at necessary failings in hospitals, apart from maybe bed capacity. That might have been an issue.
Annabelle?
Yes, I mean, that's certainly right that we have fewer beds than you see in other countries such as Germany. But you cannot deny that the NHS is a collapsing, buckling system that needs fundamental reform. And were we able to reform it, then perhaps we'd have healthcare outcomes more similar to other developed nations, unlike ones that are more similar to what you get in nations like the Czech Republic and Slovenia.
Right, well,
I'm
Damien,
not sure that collapsing and buckling is the opinion most people have after the amazing year the NHS has proceeded, to be honest.
Right, well,
we all collapse and buckle so badly.
No, well, do you see it as a buckling service, Damien, in the way Annabelle has described it, and that in fact it's the fault of the NHS system rather than politicians' decisions that have resulted in poor outcomes and a high death toll?
No, I don't see it as a buckling system, and I think actually I find that description quite offensive, given the extraordinary efforts the NHS has made over the last year to serve the needs of the nation through COVID. And we've not seen what we've seen in some other European countries of people not being able to be admitted to hospital for treatment because there weren't the facilities to treat them. I think with the increased capacity, with the Nightingale hospitals, with the fact the NHS is leading a world-leading rollout of the vaccination programme, I think these are all things that we should be very proud of. But of course, I think what the pandemic has done is stress-tested the whole system. And I think there are things that can be improved in terms of the way data is shared between different aspects of the NHS to improve the delivery of services. And I think there is a big public health question as well about saying, do we need to be fitter and healthier as a country? Are there other lessons to be learned when we look back at the impacts of the pandemic.
Okay.
But I think actually one thing we can say is that through national effort, people supported and protected the NHS by adhering to the lockdowns. The NHS had the resources it needed, and it's done an incredible job.
Right. Well, just briefly, Annabel, you wanted to say something about Nightingale hospitals, I think.
I was just asking Damien how many patients were actually treated at the Nightingale hospitals. And I'd just reiterate what I said at the outset, which is none of this is to downplay the heroic efforts of the doctors and nurses on the front line. But the issue is that they are trapped in a failed system. In terms of outcomes, quality and efficiency, it's social insurance systems that are consistently ahead of the NHS. I think we all want the same endpoint. We all want people to have access to the best possible healthcare. It's just that system like the NHS isn't able to provide it.
Right.
I think we're onto a very different subject here, but I think the performance of social insurance systems versus the NHS is highly contested. Firstly, in a pandemic, it's been a huge advantage having a universal healthcare system where people aren't frightened of the cost of going to the doctor and aren't worried about whether the insurance is up to date and so on and so on and so on. I think we've got here a case of overlaying an existing agenda for reform on a pandemic. Everyone may have had their own ideas about how to reform the NHS before this pandemic started.
All right.
But that, just sticking to those isn't learning the lessons of what the years taught.
All right, we're going to leave it there and talk about the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was agreed between the government and the EU to prevent a hard border on the island of Ireland, instead extending checks that exist and take place between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Sammy Wilson, the DUP MP, joins us now. Hello, Sammy. What do you think is going wrong with the protocol?
Everything's going wrong with the protocol. The promises that were made that Northern Ireland, as part of the United Kingdom and as part of the United Kingdom internal market, has been proven to be a false promise. That we now find that businesses in Northern Ireland, individual consumers in Northern Ireland, shops in Northern Ireland are finding difficulties in accessing supplies from Great Britain, which of course is our main market. And at the same time, we now find that in the future, and the impact of this hasn't been felt yet, in the future, laws for Northern Ireland will be made in Brussels without any reference to Northern Ireland politicians. If we don't implement them, we'll get taken infraction proceedings against us made by the European Court of Justice.
Okay.
So what we find is that the United Kingdom has really been split in two. We have a border down the Irish Sea. And I can tell you, no other European country would have accepted an arrangement like this as a result of Brexit.
Right. Well, you're very clear about your view of the protocol and how it isn't working in every aspect. Claire, how do you see it?
Well, I don't disagree that the delicate equilibrium in Northern Ireland has been disrupted, and that's why parties like mine campaign so strongly against Brexit, and that's why over the last 4.5 years we have begged politicians like Sammy Wilson to take that into account. So I absolutely regret the disruption, and I regret that the DUP and the most ultra Brexit supporters, one by one, took options off the table that would have prevented there being any east-west border between Northern Ireland and Britain, because I see that it causes some disruption to business, but that it causes injury to the sense of Britishness that some people have. I think it's worth saying that Sammy is incorrect when he said nothing is working in the protocol, and some of his colleagues have called it chaos. That's simply not a statement of fact. In the first few days of January, there was some disruption as Brexit, because it is a series of trade barriers. It has brought disruption to all parts of the United Kingdom. But on the 5th of January, we were told that Northern Ireland's supply chains were 5 days from collapse, and that has absolutely not been the case. So there are frictions, certainly, for consumers. But it's worth noting that there have been a series of surveys of businesses. 70% say that things are now back to where they were working, and fewer than one business in 5 supports the DUP proposal to call the whole thing off. But nobody loves the protocol. Yeah. I explain it as if Brexit was a car crash and the protocol is the airbag, but it was always designed to evolve. There are mechanisms in there to address some of the teething issues and some of the systemic ones, but politicians have to be willing to work them and not just try and inflict chaos.
Right. Well, you need to work with people, Sammy, to make it work.
Well, first of all, we have sought to work with people, and we have seen exactly how the EU has treated the protocol. Let me give you some examples. People in Northern Ireland who order goods on Amazon are now finding that they're not supplied to Northern Ireland. No horticultural project, things like seeds, plants, etc., can be brought into Northern Ireland for fear that they're contaminating the EU single market because of the soil which might be on those plants, even though that soil was perfectly acceptable on the 31st of December. Lorries are being turned back because EU officials say that the pallets are not acceptable in the European Union. We're not part of the European Union. We're part of the United Kingdom. We're part of the United Kingdom single market, or should be. And yet all of our trade is being disrupted.
All right, well,
as a result
let Claire respond.
And you know, if you're looking for the EU to be flexible on the agreement, what we have found is that the EU have insisted that the rules be imposed in the most petty way.
All right. Well, let Claire respond. I mean, what do you think of what do you make of Sammy's characterisation that this is just pettiness on behalf of the EU?
Well, it isn't. I mean, I think Sammy doesn't accept that the EU is a rules-based order. And the reason for the SPS, and you're absolutely right, that at this moment, wherever we sit on the 8th of February, there hasn't been divergence, but the UK, and backed up by votes with DUP when they were propping them up, have insisted on diverging from, the SPS rules. And that's just a reality. Of course, the solution would be UK alignment, as Norway and Switzerland and others agree that they won't, for example, introduce dangerous pesticides. But it's absolutely not the case to say that all our trade has been disrupted. Huge amounts of food stuff are coming up. I got an Amazon parcel myself here on Saturday. It's a falsehood to say that nothing is working. So as I say, there are mechanisms to work through to up the awareness, because a lot of the disruptions that people have experienced are because the rules were only agreed days before New Year's Eve, and many businesses didn't know about them. But the DUP proposal is to trash the international agreement. They are not
well, I'll come back to
with the other players.
I'll come back to Sammy on that. But first of all, Damien, wasn't this just inevitable? I mean, Sammy Wilson talks about a false promise that was made, and that in fact the United Kingdom is being split into two. But that's because Boris Johnson has pretended that a border in the Irish Sea wouldn't exist, and it does.
Well, no, I think there's a question of enforcement here. The protocol was not designed for these sorts of restrictions to be put in place. I think there's no case to be made to say that the Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom have diverged in terms of policy. I think the restrictions have been put in place for the movement of fresh and perishable goods are unacceptable. That the government is discussing that with the European Commission, and the Prime Minister's made absolutely clear that he will be prepared to invoke Article 16 of the protocol, which would suspend its provisions. So I think there needs to be a more reasonable agreement here and a more reasonable interpretation of the rules. And I have some experience on the other end of the UK on this, as my constituency is Folkestone High. I have the Channel Tunnel in my constituency. And I think, whilst there have been fantastic efforts made to support the flow of goods in and out of the country, I think there is, over-checking on the EU side to slow down the movement of goods. And I don't think it's necessary.
Sammy?
And I think that's a fair description.
Yeah, but were you sold down the river? But were you sold down the river by Boris Johnson and the government over what the reality would be?
Well, I think that, first of all, we always knew what the reality would be once we saw what was contained in the Northern Ireland Protocol. Right. We warned the government of this.
Which Damien signed up to.
And the government proceeded with it. And I believe that there is an opportunity for the Prime Minister. He's got plenty of scope for changing the agreement if he's got the political will. And we saw how the EU casually tossed aside the protocol when it suited them to cover up their own embarrassment about their vaccine programme, albeit they quickly withdrew it, but they still have maintained that they could introduce the Article 16 of the protocol at any stage. And we're saying to the government, if the EU can so casually toss aside the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol, then to protect UK citizens and UK businesses and to protect the UK internal market and the integrity of the United Kingdom, he should be prepared to do the same.
Right. Well, Damien, is that what should happen? That the government should also invoke Article 16? Is that going to help?
Well, the Prime Minister said just a few days ago that was, as far as he was concerned, that option was on the table. I'm sure there's a way of negotiating a satisfactory outcome for this, but as the EU have demonstrated themselves, the idea that Article 16 couldn't have been invoked is not the case. But I think it's in all parties' interest to make sure we get a positive agreement and we get goods flowing as they should do. But I think that we have to see that the most important thing in Northern Ireland ultimately is the support of the Good Friday Agreement, the protection of community life in Northern Ireland, and that anything that is undermining that and causing unnecessary friction and tension, then we should err on the side of supporting the community there, if that means invoking Article 16 and revoking elements of the protocol.
Right. Well, I mean, Sammy, just before we move on, when she was Prime Minister in 2018, Theresa May said that no UK Prime Minister could ever agree to divide Britain and Northern Ireland. And that is why she wanted what we now know as a softer Brexit. Was she right?
No, she wasn't. And of course, a softer Brexit did not ensure that Northern Ireland would not be in the same position as we are today, because there was the option then for the rest of the United Kingdom to opt out of the membership of not just the single market, but also the customs union, because that's what Theresa May was proposing, which first of all was not Brexit, but secondly, did not guarantee that Northern Ireland would not be left in the single market and in the customs union, and the rest of the United Kingdom would simply leave that part of the arrangement, because that was always the way in which the protocol which she was suggesting would have been drawn up. So we, in fact, would have been probably worse off under Mrs. May's proposal, because we'd have stayed not only in the single market for goods, but the single market totally, and also in the EU customs union.
All right, just very briefly, Sam, before we let you go, Claire, you wanted to come back in.
Yeah, I mean, I think I need to address, I'm concerned by Damien's comments as well. We heard in October that the government hadn't actually read the withdrawal agreement, and now it transpires that they maybe didn't actually read the protocol command paper either. And I agree with Damien that protection of the balance here and community life in the Good Friday Agreement are crucial. But if people meant that, then they wouldn't have pushed the most extreme Brexit possible. And the reality is that if you trigger Article 16, you have a hard border on the island of Ireland. So we spent 4 years discussing why that was politically and practically inappropriate. So if people are playing the tear the whole thing up because of some manufactured outrage and some disruptions, then they need to have alternatives, but they don't. So what they are doing is playing with the stability of communities and playing with the stability businesses needs. And there are opportunities for businesses here to be at the hinge of both economies if people could drop the shackles and the myopia and actually find them.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Sammy Wilson, thank you very much for joining us for that discussion. We're going to hear from Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, who's been out and about today, answering questions about the efficacy of the AstraZeneca vaccine with the South African variant.
We're very confident in all the vaccines that we're using, and I think it's important for people to bear in mind that all of them we think are effective in delivering a high degree of protection against serious illness and death, which is the most important thing. We'll be continuing to study the results, the effectiveness of the vaccine rollout, and that's going very, very fast indeed.
That's the Prime Minister answering questions there. Let me just draw your attention to this story in The Telegraph, which says exclusive far-left influence on Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion to be probed. Now, this is the story that the former Labour MP John Woodcock, who now sits in the House of Lords, has been appointed as the government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption. Now, Woodcock himself has warned that the UK must heed the growth of the far right, following what has gone on, as he says, in the US, but must also be vigilant against a similar blind spot in Britain to the prospect of progressive extremism. Damien, what is the threat from the far left?
Well, I think we see a threat from extreme forces in the political debate. This has been fueled in part by the way social media works and creates divisions in society. It's how things radicalise people on the extremes of society. And we know that it has also been used by countries like Russia to try and sow division, not just in the UK, but in America and elsewhere in Europe as well. So I think we need to be very alive to the divisions that are and the increasing extremes we're seeing in society and the violence that can come from that, and recognising that this is a real threat that we need to address, both in looking at the groups and individuals that are fueling it, but also looking, as we will do in the online harms legislation when it comes later this year, at the role of social media platforms in amplifying and boosting radicalised speech and hate speech, which is fueling the problem.
Right, Gabby, are these concerns justified? Does it require another independent advisor?
I think it depends what the scope of this inquiry is, because lots of people are worried about, the disinformation that we've seen over the last year, as Damien says, the growth of extremism and the way it's propagated into media, which we've done great work on, and also, the prospect of radicalisation during the pandemic. Lots of people stuck at home, feeling extremely angry with the world, and are you vulnerable at that point to extreme periods? But what we're talking about, what seems to be discussed here, is things that really most people would not define as extremism. Black Lives Matter protests, Extinction Rebellion. These are protests where there may have been arrests. These are protests where there may have been criminality of some description, or laws broken, or acts of criminal damage, or whatever. But that's not what most people think of necessarily. There's a very fine line between that and what most people think of when they think of radicalisation and extremism, which is terrorism. And John Walker says in the interview that he's not suggesting there's an equivalence between the far right and the far left. We know that the threat from far right violence and far right terrorism, has significantly increased. But to bring them in the same context, I think that's going to worry a lot of people. Are we talking really here about protest rather than extremism, and what the limits of protest are? Are we talking about describing organisations that government just doesn't like the sound of as extremists? I think there's some really blurring of lines going on there.
Annabelle, how do you see it?
Well, I think the review is probably quite a sensible idea. Now, I think that this behaviour can pose a threat in terms of the disruption that it causes or the violence that it causes, but I think it also poses a threat to, or at least the extremist factions of groups like Extinction Rebellion and perhaps Black Lives Matter pose a threat to their own cause. They undermine their own cause. We all care emphatically about racism in society and wanting to stamp that out. And we also care about tackling climate change. My concern is that these extremist factions of some groups can turn the public against what are very, very important causes.
Right. I mean, what's your view, Claire, particularly when we're looking at Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion? I mean, is it necessary to respond in this way? Is it extremism that needs to be tackled?
Well, I think the review in itself is a good idea, but if it is going to be just used as a culture war to imply that there's only extremism, in one part of political debate, then it won't go anywhere, because we do have to tackle disinformation loops and extremism wherever we find it. But as we find with the likes of the Human Intelligence Bill, putting all the focus on groups on the left isn't where the threat is. We saw very recently through Trump, and we know that there are Trumps everywhere, how quickly on the far right misinformation and disinformation and demagogues can conspire and spill out into everyday life. That's something we see every day in Northern Ireland. We had border guards had to be removed from their jobs last week due to threats that came from the far right. So I think absolutely tackle extremism, absolutely promote media literacy and information literacy, particularly online, which is where people are getting their information. Okay. But don't use it as some sort of manufactured tool to imply that there's, the left wing is terrorist. Meet the threat where it is. It's not a culture war tool.
Damien?
Well, I don't think it's about that. I think the issue is where any organisation is inciting individuals to commit violent acts or acting against other people. That's something we should care about. And there can be radical forces with any political movement that are left or right extremes that can seek to do that. We should also take more seriously, and I think the Online Harms Bill needs to do this, some of the terrible at-scale racist and anti-Semitic abuse, which is often common currency, particularly against public profiles and celebrities on social media, and see that as an issue that needs to be addressed as well. And the way in which outside bodies seek to manipulate and exacerbate tensions and divisions in society, and the real world physical harm that can come from that. And we've seen that not just in political debate in the last year, but also in the anti-vaccine movement, in the arson attacks on 5G phone masks, because there were false accusations that they were being used to spread coronavirus. So we see this all the time. And I think again, what happened, as Claire mentioned, what happened in Washington on the 6th of January, where we saw a sort of a violent insurrection which led to 5 people being killed at the US Capitol. we've got to be really concerned about the forces that are driving that in society, where this is coming from, and how social media is being used to amplify it.
All right, we've run out of time in the closing seconds of the programme. Thank you to all of my guests, and also to say that the Home Secretary has announced that the terror threat has been reduced from severe to substantial. That is all we have time for today, but please join me again tomorrow at 12:15. Bye-bye.